Trans and non-binary people have always existed. Let's start there. While it's hard to apply modern English words like transgender or non-binary to people from outside the West and especially to people from the past, we can look at countless examples of people who are gender nonconforming, gender fluid, and otherwise outside of the cisgender binary we know today. To me, this is the most convincing case for trans and non-binary inclusion in our modern society. Lots of societies across history have arrived at the idea that gender isn't as simple as XX or XY. In fact, we now know that even chromosomal sex isn't so simple. But this rarely gets talked about in any manner of depth within popular discourse. When it is, it's simply brought up as a gotcha to conservatives, but I feel like we never really sit in this idea that transness is something that has existed for as long as gender has. Like, here's a trend that I've noticed. A lot of the commonly cited examples of gender-expansive people throughout cultures didn't just exist. They were important figures in their communities. Take Hijra people, for example. They're a legally recognized third gender in India with a special place in Hinduism as having the power to bless or curse people. Or the multiple two-spirit traditions across many American indigenous cultures, who usually hold special traditional and ceremonial roles. Or the Sangama, Zulu healers who use divination, herbal medicine, and other rituals to cure illnesses, and often wouldn't identify as either men or women. Why is gender expansiveness so closely associated with special power? Is gender just an individual experience of personal identity, or is it something more communal, something more spiritual than we in the West think of it as? And most importantly, if trans and non-binary people have always existed, why is it that conservatives want to crush us so badly? If you're not aware, literally hundreds of bills limiting trans people's right to access life-saving medications and surgeries have been proposed in the United States the past year, in the largest coordinated attack on trans existence in recent history. Political commentators like Jordan Peterson and journalists like Abigail Shrier have called trans people a contagion, and conservative talking heads like Tucker Carlson and Matt Walsh work exceedingly hard to tell their fans that not only are there two genders, but that the gender debate has long been settled in favor of a simple, binary, patriarchal worldview. What's going on here? Are these types of attacks brand new, or have we seen them before? Essentially, what is transphobia? And what is it about gender-expansive people that's so threatening to cisgender people? Not you, of course. If you're cis and listening to this, I'm sure you're one of the good ones. Here at Rule 63, we try to advance trans discourse beyond the Trans 101 to understand the complexities of systemic oppression around gender issues. In this episode, I want to introduce the idea that trans people are not only valid in their identities, but are actually really significant figures in society. Because intellectually knowing that trans people have always existed is different from understanding that trans people are really powerful, and why big institutions like world governments want to regulate us out of existence. I also want to share with cis people just how important it is to take a hard look at their own gender, and I want to affirm for our trans listeners, especially our trans listeners of color, just how powerful they really are. Luckily, I know just the people who can help me do that.
I think that what was really important to me was being able to own this identity and really claim it and really be like, no, actually, I am trans enough. And perhaps even more importantly, in more recent years, actually being trans is amazing and not just like something that has happened to me or something that I have to deal with. It's actually a gift. And coming to that was a very long process, but I'm extremely grateful.
Dr. Eli Lawliet, aka the Gender Doula, is one of the first people with a career in providing emotional and spiritual support for those who want to get a better understanding of their gender. Eli describes his work as full spectrum support for those who are exploring, questioning, or transitioning their gender. Eli also offers a variety of workshops, classes, and resources related to transition, gender exploration, and personal growth through a trans lens.
If something so basic as like manhood or womanhood can be like wrong or can be questioned, it introduces like instability to like the whole project of like the regime, right?
Talking to Eli about gender and spirituality was really enlightening. And because there is so much to talk about when it comes to gender and spirituality, this will be a rare Rule 63 two-guest episode.
The specific way that we in the West conceptualize gender is very much based on European notions of empiricism and this, so you cannot, if you have this genital, you are this gender. And that's the thing that trans people here and around the world are constantly having to push back on. That's not true.
YM Carrington is a Black trans Jewish activist and content creator who focuses on anti-oppression, liberation, and accessibility. They have a lot to say about how transphobia is intertwined with other systems of oppression and how we can all work together to fight against the shared threat of fascism.
And it, definitely as we as adults look at the landscape and we see the attacks on trans youth, trans kids in schools, trans existence in general, it's like we know why these cis authorities are scared, because now the kids have language to describe their experiences.
So, without further ado, my name is Anna Marie, PhD, and welcome to Rule 63. This episode has content notices for transphobia, racism, colonialism, and anti-Semitism. So, you've just opened up a podcast episode titled Trans People Are Sacred. And that's great. I'm super glad you did that. Subscribe for more amazing trans content. But before we get into the meat of this, I need you to do something for me. Assuming you're not listening to this while driving or on the treadmill or doing something relatively dangerous that needs your attention, I need you to close your eyes and imagine that directly in front of you, there's this big, blinking neon sign that reads, "We cannot apply modern Western labels to different cultures across different time periods." This sign will be really important as we walk through time and look back on the traditions of gender diversity that have existed throughout history. So assuming you don't have aphantasia, a rare condition where you can't envision things in your mind, just always have that sign handy. Because it's true, people who we in the West in 2022 might call non-binary or transgender have always existed. I can rattle off several examples of societies with more than 2 canonical genders, and trust me, I will very shortly. But the terms transgender and non-binary, as we in North America might conceive of them, even though we use those terms as umbrella terms, may not be the terms used by other gender-diverse people throughout the world today, and we definitely can't apply these labels to practices started hundreds or thousands of years ago. For the purposes of this episode, we are going to be talking broadly about people who change genders at some point in their lives, or people who fall outside a strict cisgender male-female binary. But always remember the sign, okay? Great. Now I'll be perfectly honest with you. When I was looking into the religious and spiritual significance of gender-expansive people, I was a little out of my depth. I have long been a secular person with a secular view of trans acceptance. Basically, regardless of what you believe about the souls of people and what gender those souls are, it just seems to be the practical reality that some percentage of people who were assigned male at birth choose to live their lives as non-men, and some percentage of people who are assigned female at birth choose to live their lives as non-women. And if that's your entire view, that's awesome. I'm not going to try to sell you on any particular brand of New Age spiritualism, and I'm definitely not going to sell you on a particular organized religion. But when I was conceiving of this episode, I knew I had to talk to someone who conceived of their own transgender identity as something that was deeply spiritual. And who better to talk to than someone who's made it their life's mission to help people navigate their relationship to gender?
So being a gender doula, how I like to describe it is that I give full spectrum support to people who are questioning, exploring, or transitioning their gender. And what I mean by that is probably the broadest version of what you could imagine that means.
Eli, who just finished his PhD a few weeks ago, so I'm going to call him Dr. Lawliet because I gotta respect a fellow doctor, calls himself the gender doula, one of the first practitioners of this line of work. He draws on the traditions of doulas to guide people through their gender journeys.
For some folks, they're coming to me very specifically like, I know I want this surgery. I need to find a provider. I need to know how to prepare for it. I need to know how to heal from it. And often I'll help people make rituals, especially around surgery, for preparing for surgery, for bringing their body into the process as an ally, and for releasing whatever part of their body they're releasing. So that can be one part of my work. Also, sometimes people come to me and they're like, I really just have all these questions and I need to talk about it. Or I'm curious about testosterone and surgery, but I don't know if that's right for me, right? Or sometimes there's a very large number of people who just need to hear somebody say it's okay to pursue medical transition, and once we've done that, they're pretty much off to the races and we're good, and so like it can mean that. It can also mean somebody being like, I don't know how the hell I'm supposed to wear women's clothes, or I don't know how the hell I'm supposed to wear men's clothes. Like, can you walk me through this? And I'm like, yes, let me introduce you to the ridiculous sizing and cut differences across clothing that's gendered.
You may have heard of a birth doula, a non medical practitioner who provides social and emotional support during pregnancy, childbirth, and post pregnancy aftercare. Or a death doula, who helps people navigate the tricky process of grieving a loved one. In the same way, Eli helps people navigate their gender and usher in their new gender identities.
The reason doulas exist is because we don't have solid community structures. Because if we had solid community structures, you would have people in the community who are filling that role, right? And that's true for death doulas, birth doulas, abortion doulas, and gender doulas. And I'm sure all doulas, right? And so it's very much a role that is born out of need of the community not being adequately organized to support all the members.
Gender is something that permeates every aspect of our lives, so one could imagine that changing genders is something that comes with a lot of growing pains. It's something that makes Eli's work incredibly wide-ranging.
But it's interesting because a lot of times when people start to work with me, the first thing, or like the first time that we kind of get quote unquote off topic. So like, let's say that they're like, I know I'm here to talk about gender, but work this week was really like crazy and this thing happened and da da da, and I just need to process it. I'm so sorry. Like, I know that you're here to talk to me about gender. And I'm like, we are talking about gender. Like, work is almost always about gender, And I mean, I've had clients that like for months all we talked about was their job, but it was about gender. And so it does end up getting a little difficult to define just because it can mean so many different things to so many different people.
Importantly, Dr. Lawliet is not a medical doctor and can't prescribe HRT, but he does help his clients advocate for themselves if medical transition is something that they want to pursue.
It's a role that kind of, again, sort of works in a liminal space because I have a PhD. I'm not a medical professional, but I have been studying trans medicine for 10 years and I understand it very well. So I can explain all the aspects of like medical stuff for trans people and also explain how to translate your desires to a doctor in a way the doctor can hear you. But I can't tell you like specific medical things about your body.
For a lot of people, one part of gender transition is going to a doctor to receive medical treatment like HRT or surgeries. And knowing how to advocate for yourself is an important skill that some people need coaching through, especially so that they don't get pushed into an area of transition they may not be ready for.
But that's a really important space because oftentimes most of my clients have medical trauma and they go into the room and the doctor's like, do this. And they're like, okay. And then, so like having someone that they can really hash it out with, like, listen, I don't know if I want to go bald, but I really want to take T. What do I do? That's really, I think, a helpful space to have to go.
I find Dr. Lawliet's work especially important in a world where a lot of trans people don't have that much real life support and are mostly getting transition advice off the internet. Trans people deserve holistic support, which means not only getting medical advice for their transition, but also social support and spiritual guidance. Now, if you're cisgender and listening to this, you might be thinking, that's really cool. I'm glad that some trans people can get this kind of guidance. But actually, Eli doesn't just work with other trans people.
And I think one thing that's really interesting is I've noticed so many cis people grappling with this. Like, I've had people come to me in my capacity as a gender doula who are cis, and they're not questioning their gender with regard to transitioning, but they're questioning their gender with regard to how the fuck am I supposed to be a woman in this current world? Like, given the racism, given the, all of the really gross essentialism, given, my desire to be aligned with trans people politically, like, how do I even start to begin to approach my identity? And it's like, yeah, good fucking question. Like, we've really gotten this shit off the rails. So like, let's talk about it,
Eli started their work thinking that they would only be helping other trans people usher in their new gender identities. But the more he talked about his work publicly, the more cisgender people wanted to take advantage of his unique services.
When I first got the idea to be a gender doula, I was like, okay, cool. I will help trans people transition. And then I started telling people that I was going to be doing this work. And all these people who I'd always only known as cis were like, oh, I could really use that. And I was like, excuse me? What are you talking about? But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, oh no, actually, like the problem is that we live in a culture with a damaged relationship to gender.
It turns out when manosphere influencers say things like, there's a masculinity crisis in this country, they are kind of pointing in the direction of something true. Heartbreaking, worst person you know kind of has a point. However, their proposed solution is to slide backwards to a 1950s gender hierarchy, whereas ours is to move forwards into a positive, equitable, trans-inclusive framework of gender that all people can benefit from, including cisgender people.
It is great to do things to make the world a better place for trans people. That's been my goal for a really long time now, for over a decade. And also by helping our culture heal its damaged relationship to gender, we will make the world a better place for trans people. And with that in mind, I really started to realize that gender doula work is for everyone. Like there is no one who doesn't benefit from this work. And anyone who's willing to engage with it, like in good faith, will benefit from it.
Eli encourages everybody to have a strong relationship to their gender. And not just because it's our secret trans agenda to turn everyone into blue-haired pronoun havers.
Because the thing is, if you go on a whole wild gender journey and you come back and you're like, actually, I am a cis woman, great. That is a beautiful process. That has taught you so fucking much that you will never learn from anything else. And so I believe really, really strongly that gender doulas are for everyone, gender exploration is for everyone, and that everyone benefits when more and more people are allowed to make room to open up and to explore.
Your gender should be something that brings you joy. Your gender should be something that you can play around with from time to time. Gender is super complicated because it's both an individual phenomenon and it's also this big group project that everyone contributes to. We need as many cis people on board as possible for this work. Cis men need to be in discussion with other cis men about constructing a positive form of masculinity that's pro-trans and anti-racist. Cis women need to overcome their internalized misogyny and embrace a malleable, intersectional framework of gender depression. And perhaps trans people can be the leaders, guiding both groups down the right path. As a gender doula, Eli believes what a lot of trans people believe, that gender is a deeply social and deeply spiritual phenomenon, and trans people have special access to this particular realm of knowledge.
I personally really strongly believe that transness gives us access to sacred knowledges. I call sacred knowledges. And what I mean by that is that because we walk in this transitional space, we see the world from a unique perspective that isn't available to cis people.
I really resonated with this idea. We in the West currently live in a society where the dominant cultural idea is that there are only two biological sexes, each with one corresponding gender, and that the divide between these two genders is uncrossable. The mere thought of moving from one gender to another probably sounds like witchcraft to some people. But us trans people have crossed that divide. We've existed in that liminal space between the two supposed genders. Eli talked to me at length about how they arrived at this conclusion when taking part in their own spiritual journey.
And as I did that, and as I really dug into the beliefs that came up and like the ideas that came up, I was like, oh, like not only has this all been available to me, and I've sort of been touching into it, but without meaning to. And also, like the way that I see this is very different from what I'm hearing from cis people who talk about spirituality. And I heard all of these cis people, primarily cisgender women, because that's a lot of the people that I was around in spiritual spaces, sort of grappling with gender and grappling with the ways that gender had been essentialized in various spiritual traditions. And I was like, oh, like this is not even like relevant to me. Like it's not even a part of my calculus. And I felt like I could see things in such a different perspective. And when I started talking to other trans people who were spiritual, it was very clear to me that we were all sort of in this alternative stream of awareness. So that's where I started to develop this idea that trans people have access to these sacred knowledges. And I think because, in large part, spirituality is that sort of like third stream, or that liminal space, that like space between knowings or perceptions. And trans people really like occupy that space physically and spiritually. And I think that that gives us the opportunity to open many doors.
When you're cisgender, it's easy to fall into essentialist thinking. Basically, men are this way, women are this way. But when you live for years as one gender and then live for years as another gender, you get to see how both halves live, which, as you can imagine, can give someone a lot of takeaways about how the gender binary actually works, especially when you occupy an identity that allows you to look at the world through an anti-racist historical lens.
But I think one of the ways that trans people can sort of elide these essentialisms in our spiritual knowledge is that we already know that something like a hegemonic view of the divine masculine or a divine feminine is fiction, right? And so, like, I look at it more like, okay, if we want to talk about femininity, what are we actually talking about? Because what feminine means changes drastically over time, space, culture, blah, 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 blah.
Transitioning almost always changes the way that you see the world, even down to the language that we use when we're talking about gender and gendered presentation.
And so, if you're going to talk about femininity, already you're coming from the space of a person who's alive right now, who's been subjected to white supremacy, who's been subjected to colonialism. And I'm talking about, a person who's in the Western world, especially America right now. So you've got to like be aware of all of those like danger zones around what you're saying. And then further, you have to actually break down like what are you really talking about when you're talking about these gender roles, right? And is it femininity, or is femininity just a framework or a code that you're using to refer to something else? And I think that transness gives you the space to like walk between those big hegemonic pillars, I guess, and see all of the holes and all of the opportunities that exist around and between them.
Cis people use terms like woman, female, feminine, femme, all interchangeably, and it makes trans people's heads explode because all of these things are such vastly different concepts that are all really flexible and transient. Femininity, for example, is something that manifests differently across time and cultures, from little things like how pink used to be a boy's color to bigger issues like how the concept of femininity was socially constructed around white womanhood as a way to deny womanhood and thus humanity from enslaved black women in early American history. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I highly recommend the book Fearing the Black Body by Dr. Sabrina Strings. Links to a bunch of further readings, including some YouTube videos if that's your bag, will be in the show notes. It's worth noting here that not all trans people are these sages of divine wisdom. Certainly many trans people out there are not equipped to lead this fight, especially considering the need for an anti-racist, decolonial perspective.
And I think that, and I don't think that like all trans people are just going to magic into this. I think you have to choose it. Like you have to choose to lean into it. But I do think if you choose to lean into that perspective and into that place, you can gain levels of insight, not only about gender, but also about everything gender touches, which is everything.
Basically, as trans people, we have access to incredibly useful and sacred knowledge about the inner workings of the world. We're like super powerful, but only if we opt into this pool of knowledge by doing the work to unpack our existing biases and become the wise practitioners that the world desperately needs. I asked Dr. Lawliet about the inspiration for his philosophy, and we touched on some of the mythological precedents for this idea that changing genders is something that only those blessed with sacred power can do.
It's so complicated because our way of understanding transness now is not the same as this. It's not the same as many different cultures, and also, as I mentioned before, with the racism and making of gay rights, it's been infected by eugenics and racism, especially anti-blackness, white supremacy, and the exotification of the, supposed East, or like, the Eastern cultures, right? And so with all of that, like, really gross stuff going on, I think that it's incumbent upon especially white trans and queer people to be extremely careful when looking to history for figures that we can venerate.
Remember the sign? The sign that I mentioned up top? Great.
At the same time, I think it's deeply important that we understand that this is not new, that people that we would now sort of categorize as trans have always existed, and that in many, many cultures across much of time, that has been a sacred space to occupy.
One example of many that we could look to is the goddess Inanna.
I've always really been attracted to the goddess Inanna, who became the goddess Ishtar, which is my cat's name. Um,
Inanna is an ancient Mesopotamian goddess of love, war, and fertility. She was also known for her special power to change people's genders.
she was literally called the goddess who turns woman into man and man into woman. And there was like a tradition where she or like the idea was that she would take a brooch that connoted womanhood and break the pin of it off, and then give that person a mace that connoted manhood, and then that person was a man. And then she would take the mace from a man and give that person a brooch, and that connoted womanhood, and that person would become a woman. And then some of her, I don't know how you would call it, priestesses or like officiants or something, would dress in these costumes where half of the outfit was the masculine attire and half was the feminine attire. And that was the correct way of dressing for certain rituals that were done in her name.
Not gonna lie, it's pretty cool to think about trans people millennia ago who had a goddess just for them.
And so knowing that you have this incredible goddess, I don't know, my brain is failing me on when exactly the Inanna version of this goddess was like revered, but I think it was like 4 or 5,000 years ago. And knowing that you have this goddess who is like just transitioning people left and right, being like, all right, I'm going to give you a special gift, like you're holy now, you get to transition, right? It also makes me like, it makes my heart so warm to think of like little trans kids and trans people, like all those, centuries and centuries ago, being like, I just need to pray to Inanna and then I can get transitioned, like, oh, it's beautiful to me.
I'm
And
gonna
so I think,
cry.
I know. I was reading this the other morning with my coffee and I was like, cool, cool, okay.
There's also the Greek story of Iphis, who, to put it in modern terms, was someone assigned female at birth and raised as a boy.
But I do think obviously there's a huge issue with white people just loving Greek culture or their interpretation of Greek culture a little too intensely. But this myth is very beautiful. So basically, there's this woman who's going to have a baby. For some reason, it's like if she doesn't have a boy, the baby's going to get killed. I think because they didn't have enough money or something. I don't quite remember the story, that part of the story. But anyway, she has to have a boy. But of course, she gives birth to a child that they understand to be a girl. So she's like, no problem. Obviously, my husband's never going to look at this baby because I am the one who's going to be responsible for everything. And so I'll just tell him the baby's a boy and I'll raise the baby as a boy. So she raises this child as a boy. And then the child becomes an adolescent and falls in love with their best friend, who's a girl. And they're like, oh my God, like, I want to marry this girl. And so, like, right before they're going to get married to this girl, the mom's like, something, this is going to be a problem. If people realize that this whole time I've been like, raising this child as a boy when they were assigned female at birth, as we would understand it currently.
And then, after the mother prays to the goddess Isis, Iphis was transformed into a male.
She goes to pray to the goddess and she's like, please help me. Like, this child needs to be a boy. And the goddess is like, no worries. And just like transes the kid. Kid wakes up a boy, gets married to his best friend, and they have like a happy life.
These are just two of the countless examples of gods and goddesses who either change their own genders or change the genders of those who are deemed worthy. I'll put a lot more examples in the show notes too. So yeah, there's a lot of precedent for this idea that crossing or existing between the binary genders is associated with some kind of special power, which tells us a lot about how gender used to be perceived before modern society and the gender binary that we know today was ushered in.
Basically, in my understanding, there are many cultures across space and time where transness is associated with some sort of spiritual uh, job or office or capacity that is greater than what is typical. I'll say it that way.
And there's more to say on the various precedents for transness in spirituality and religion, but real quick, I'd like to plug Dr. Lawliet's upcoming class.
Which is very much a class where I'm using some of what we talked about in terms of like the spiritual awareness that trans gives you to like create something that is useful for people of any identity or experience. The class is called Snake Medicine, and it's a class that I developed by the spiritual practice that I described earlier, just literally watching my snakes. So I have two snakes. My partner has two snakes. I have a ball python and a gray banded king snake. And when I got them, I was aware that snakes shed their skin. I was not aware of what an intricate and interesting process that was, or all the different ways that that process could go wrong, and all the different ways that snakes use that process in their bodies. And through watching that and through having my own like scary moment of one of my snakes really struggling with a shed, I sort of had this idea of like, oh, wait, this is actually a really useful process for figuring out like how to move through periods of growth and discomfort and pain in a way that leads us into greater growth and, healing.
Who wouldn't want to take a gender class inspired by snakes? If you're interested in the gender doula's work and want to get started on your own gender journey, the class starts on September 12th, 2022 and runs for several weeks, so sign up today. So, checking in here, we laid the groundwork for this idea that gender is something communal and spiritual, and gave a couple key examples from mythology. But do we really have to look back to ancient Mesopotamia and Greek myth to find examples of trans identity? For another perspective, I reached out to one of my favorite activists of all time, Y.M. Carrington, aka Sista Yiddishkeit. Y.M. was raised in a black Christian church, but from a very young age was called to Judaism, and their spiritual journey coincided with their trans journey.
Well, early on, in those days where I knew I wasn't, 4 or 5 years old, I knew I wasn't like the other girls. And I was very, again, remember, not having language to describe any of this stuff around identity or religion or gender or anything. I had no language. But I knew that I was being forced into the mold of like black girl, black Southern cis Baptist womanhood. I knew I was being forced into that, even though I had none of that language to describe it.
It was learning about Christianity and growing up in the highly communal environment of a black church that taught them about being Jewish.
As a kid, going to Sunday school, going to church, watching Bible movies on TV, they're talking about Jesus and they're talking about the world, the first century Middle Eastern Roman occupied world that Jesus lived in. And they're talking about, they're talking about Jesus, they're talking about his disciples, they're talking about his experiences, they're talking about the Roman authorities, but they're also talking about Jewish people. And I distinctly remember watching one of those movies and like I have no idea why this thought came into my brain, but I remember thinking to myself, I am a Jew. I am a Jew. And again, no context. There's no context where that should ever make sense because I'm just a kid watching Bible stories, Christian Bible stories on TV. And they're mentioning Jews in passing because Jesus lived in a Jewish world that was occupied by the Romans. And that's the context. But I'm just like, I'm a Jew. I am a Jew. And as I said that, I'm seeing myself as a Jewish boy. What I really think now, it was the universe telling me, this is who you are, YM, and whatever you go through, wherever you go in life, whatever other people push you to be, or where you end up, or wherever you go, this is who you are.
As they grew up, YM not only came into their identity as a man, but went through the formal process of converting to Judaism, which of course, because of dominant cultural expectations for what Jewish people look like, turned some heads.
And when I started, I would, most people would have said, that's a Black woman converting to Judaism. That Black woman is going through the process of converting to Judaism. Now I'm very clear. I was never a Black woman converting to Judaism. I am a Jewish man that grew up in the Black church. Now I was Jewish then. I am Jewish now. I was a Jewish boy that grew up in the Black church. That's my lived experience.
If the idea of a Black Jewish person is new to you, I highly recommend following YM and other Black Jewish creators. There's a lot of overlap between and diversity within these communities that you could probably make a whole separate podcast episode about. Or maybe 50.
In terms of Black Jews globally, African American Jews are probably, Jews are misunderstood everywhere. I don't want to act like, we're the only people that are misunderstood. But the African American Jewish experience is very much not understood in its own right, because we are descendants of West Africans who grew up around European Jews. That is our lived experience. That is how we come into the Jewish world. There are African Americans who have been Jewish for centuries. African American families who have been Jewish for centuries in this country. They exist. But their initial exposure to Judaism was through enslavement. Like, they probably had a master who was Jewish. That's definitely true of Afro-Caribbean Jews that are descended from Jamaica and Haiti. We have to understand that Black Jewish people are as varied ethnically as non-Black Jews. We have to understand that we don't all, just because we're Black doesn't mean we all come from the same Jewish tradition. Like, Black Judaism is a rich, varied, diverse tradition, and that's one thing I want everybody to understand about it. Don't assume that there's only one experience of Black Jewishness. There isn't. It's again, our community is very diverse.
And while I'm neither Black nor Jewish myself, it's not hard to understand the ideological overlap between the teachings of the Black Church and Jewish teachings. YM explains how their upbringing in the Black Church taught them some of the same liberatory ideology as many Jewish people learn.
The Exodus is a big, obviously the Exodus is the background of the Passover story, right?
Yeah.
But in African American culture, the Exodus is a huge symbolically spiritual event because of our modern experience with chattel slavery in the United States. And when African people were enslaved in the United States and they learned the story of the Exodus, that was the one core story that they really held on to, because the emancipation of Jewish people in Egypt mirrored the struggle for emancipation of African Americans here in the United States. And so that's why that was how so many Black and Jewish people became connected, was through the Exodus story. That's how Black and Jewish people in the United States have traditionally bonded. I can't stress, I'm just saying, I cannot stress how important that story is in both Judaism and African American Christianity. It's huge. And having that base from the Black church, it very much helped me when I was going through the religious conversion to Judaism, because I had it. Those experiences, even though I hate Christianity and I am not a Christian, that Baptist church experience gave me two very important experiences. It taught me about the Black church and the struggle of African Americans for liberation and social equality. But it also is where I learned the bare bones of Judaism, because I was learning Judaism through Bible stories. I was learning Judaism through Bible study. Even though these, it's thoroughly Baptist, thoroughly Christian Bible study, I'm learning who the Hebrew prophets were. I'm reading, I'm learning all the Torah stories, even though we didn't call them Torah stories, they were just Old Testament stories.
We're barely scratching the surface of the Black Jewish experience and Black Jewish relations, but it's definitely worth highlighting an example of solidarity across marginalized groups and how universal these stories of liberation can be. In fact, YM wants all people, especially white Jews, to understand these important connections.
If a lot of white Jewish people in this country are listening, because white people that actually grew up in the synagogue and everything, they're like, how could that be? No, like visit a black church, you'll see what I'm talking about. That's how it is. I feel like a lot of white Jews their experience of Christianity is white Christianity. That's the only one they've seen. So they don't know the black church experience of Christianity. But I invite white Jewish people to look at the black church and look at how our folks engage with the Bible text, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. I need my fellow Jews to see that. For me, that whole experience was more about blackness than Christianity. It was about rooting me in the black tradition.
YM's whole life story is heartwarming and fascinating, and you could hear them talk about it at length if you become a patron of Rule 63. For now, I want to get back to gender, because Jewish teachings do have something to say about gender, and YM carries on those traditions in their daily life.
Judaism started out mainly as a ritual-based spirituality, what we call temple Judaism, right? Judaism evolved, and our leaders, who we eventually started calling rabbis, when they developed their tradition, they created this book of spiritual commentary called the Talmud. That's what the Talmud is. The Talmud is the millennia-old collection of rabbinical commentary, argument, and debate.
It was in these documents that rabbis from thousands of years ago recognized the practical reality that there are more than two genders.
Early on, Judaism, the rabbis recognized that there were multiple genders. Talmudic literature has recognized multiple genders for millennia. The sages recognized that there were 6 distinct genders that humans had. And it's important. Now, whether you agree with those specific categories the rabbis came up with or not, that was the rabbis making clear that gender was not a binary. They were making it clear.
If you're hearing this and wondering, so where are all these non-binary Jewish people then? First of all, look harder, because they are definitely out there, trust me. And second of all, it can be pretty easy to forget teachings like this over the course of thousands of years.
What we know of Judaism in the United States is very much shaped by the European experience of Judaism. Judaism is, obviously it was created in Asia. It predates modern Europe. It predates modern European statehood and all that. But we mostly in the United States know the European experience of being Jewish.
Spoiler alert for the back half of this episode, but traditions of gender can be lost when navigating a dominant society that's very cisgender. When YM was transitioning, this was exactly the kind of colonized history that they had to reckon with.
But again, it's that parallel of like I had to find language around my transness. I had to find language around my spirituality, and I had to find it because I wasn't going to get it from society. Because like all cis people, cis Black people and cis Jewish people are indoctrinated into this colonial society. Like I was raised by largely Black cis women. That's who raised me. And then I come into a spiritual community that's largely controlled by men. Not for the most. I mean, Judaism now is a lot more welcoming, in terms of like women rabbis and women leadership and LGBTQ leadership. But it's still very, in the United States, Judaism is very much an institution that is shaped by European masculine experience. That's the reality. What I'm clear about now is that this is my Black Jewish experience, and it is not rooted in cisness, nor Christianity, nor whiteness. Like I am independent of whiteness and Christianity and cisness. This is my experience.
Nowadays, YM can look back to their history and find peace within their trans identity.
I also know that my Black and Jewish ancestors, were clear that gender variance and gender expansion were normal. I'm clear about that now. The cisnormativity that I grew up with and witnessed in the society was not the norm for my ancestors. I know that now. It was not the norm. Because I have the history before we were forced to become cis people.
YM roots their understanding of gender not only in their Jewish ancestry, but in their Black ancestry. specifically their Yoruba heritage.
I draw my cultural grounding. My culture is grounded in West African Yoruba, because my ancestors were largely Yoruba.
Yoruba is a West African ethnic group that currently occupies parts of Nigeria, Benin, and Togo. They're also a pretty famous example of a society that recognizes numerous genders. I'll again call attention to the sign. Remember the sign, applying modern Western identity labels to other contexts. Not good.
And Yoruba people talk about this today. Yoruba tradition does not recognize gender the way Western Christian patriarchy does. They don't see gender as tied to genitals or body. They see gender as tied to the spirit of the person.
The Yoruba language has no gendered pronouns like he and she, and in their culture, one's gender emerges from how they move throughout the world.
When a person is born and when they come into their identity, their personality, that's when you know, according to Yoruba tradition, whether they're a man or a woman or not. That's how you know, because it's their spirit. Their spirit determines what their gender is. Of course, that means that a lot of people that would be called, would be called boys in our culture were actually girls and women in Yoruba culture, and vice versa.
This is, obviously, hugely different than how we in the West view gender, as something strictly tied to an empirically measurable biological sex. This isn't trivial. It actually reflects differing philosophies of how knowledge works.
The specific way that we in the West conceptualize gender is very much based on European notions of empiricism, and this is this, so you cannot, if you have this genital, you are this gender. And that's the thing that trans people here and around the world are constantly having to push back on. That's not true.
To put this in philosophical terms, there's this Cartesian approach to knowledge that says these are the two sexes and these are the two genders that can be measured in XYZ ways. But there's also an embodied knowledge, an experiential knowledge that says that sex and gender aren't that simple. An experiential knowledge that trans people have been embodying for generations. Trans and non-binary people, through their lived experience of gender, and if you're so inclined, through their access to liminal spaces, are accessing this embodied knowledge of gender as something communal and spiritual, which goes against cisgender scientific institutions.
Empirically, we know as trans people that's not true, because empirically now we know about chromosomes, we know about intersex conditions. So to say that the genital is the evidence, we know now is bullshit. But for centuries, in terms of Western thinking, they based gender on the appearance of genitals. And we're now having to argue with the largely cisgender institutions of power that no, that's not how gender works. We know in our bodies as trans people, that's not how gender works. That is not how gender works at all. And that's what, Yoruba people understood. It's what so many communities around the world understood about gender, that it was a spiritual identity. It was a communal identity.
Science isn't just something done in fancy high-tech buildings by people in lab coats and shared in academic journals that charge $50 an article. Knowledge can be generated and shared in lots of ways, including embodied knowledge and wisdom passed down by elders and sages to those deserving of it. I'm a research scientist myself, and like I said at the top of the episode, I find it really fascinating that across times and cultures, different societies keep independently discovering the idea that sex and gender aren't binary fixed things. This is basically the same thing as numerous scientists going out into the field and drawing the same conclusions based on independent measurements. So I would argue that it's extremely scientifically accurate to say that trans and non-binary people are not only valid, but are important to society's progression. I'll leave it up to you on whether you want to view the sacred knowledge of trans people as a type of science, opening up your personal definition of science to include not just people in lab coats, but the embodied knowledge of marginalized people, or if you want to view the sacred knowledge of trans people as a strictly spiritual or religious phenomenon, separate from the institution of capital S science. But at the end of the day, I don't think the difference matters that much. In my opinion, science and religion aren't fundamentally at odds with each other. It's just that transphobia, colonialism, and other forms of oppression are driving a wedge between them. And whatever you believe, if you're trans and non-binary, you are special. You are powerful, you are sacred, and you have a rich ancestry to learn from.
Again, it depends on whether you know the traditions of your ancestors or not. So for me, I know the traditions of Yoruba people, and I know the traditions of the sages and the rabbis who created what we now know as rabbinical Judaism. We have rich traditions that we come from, and for me, this is the real antidote to whiteness, right? That these powerful, centuries, millennia old, sometimes cultural traditions that so many of our people can look to, can draw on. And when BIPOC people transition, that's what we draw on.
It can be really enriching to know that you descend from queer and trans ancestors. Even Eli, a white trans person, went back into his ancestry and found a deeper relationship to spirituality by using a decolonial anti-racist lens and by being incredibly careful not to culturally appropriate. Here's some of his story.
Well, and part of the reason for that is because my cultural background is Irish, predominantly, and also, Euromut a little bit on my mom's side. And so I come from a mixture of cultures that colonized and were colonized. And I really at first tried, because I don't want to culturally appropriate. I tried to go back in to find out, like, okay, can I connect to pre-Christianity Irish like belief systems? And so I went and did a bunch of research on that. And I went through this really deep realization that, like, Ireland was colonized by Christianity. I too was colonized by Christianity, and I actually share that in common with that land. And so instead of trying to look for some forgotten um, spirituality or practice that I could like root into, I realized that my ancestors' like spiritual practices exist in me, and I can rely on my internal knowing, my intuition, my ancestral knowing, and my connections with nature to bring me the lessons that I need to learn and to connect me to the spiritual without appropriating from any culture that is inappropriate for me to appropriate from, or without getting involved in anything that's like gross, right? And so that's really how I came to my spirituality, which I feel like is an available path for anyone who needs a path like that.
And these are just a couple of examples for how spirituality, religion, and transness intersect. Whether it's rediscovering your own Christianity outside of your church's homophobic practitioners, or going your own way like our doula friend, there is a rich diversity of spiritual beliefs among trans and non-binary people. But there's one missing connection that we need to make to understand the full picture. If trans people have always existed, how did we get to a place where being cisgender is seen as the default? Why is so little known about these ancient traditions of gender, and why are conservatives so hellbent on keeping trans people down? In the next portion of the episode, we're going to talk about how we got here, but first we're going to take a quick ad break. I know this is a long one, so, take a break, get yourself some water, and we can get right back to it. Rule 63 is brought to you in part by listeners like you. If you like what you're hearing and you want to hear even more sweet, sweet content from me, Anna Marie, and my co-producer Danny, you can give us just a couple dollars a month to get access to tons of bonus content. Included in that content is the full uncut interview with every guest we've ever had on the show, including the interviews with Eli and YM used in this very episode. Just one big oral history of transness out here. I was particularly struck by both of my guests' journeys into their religious and spiritual beliefs. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to put their entire stories into the episode for time reasons. We are already at almost an hour here, but for just a couple bucks a month, like I said, you can hear about them straight from the source. Danny and I also do bonus commentary for every new episode that drops and monthly live streams where you can discuss your thoughts on this month's topic with us. If that sounds fun to you, or if you just want to support the show out of the goodness of your own heart, head on over to patreon.com/rule63. That's patreon.com/rule63. RULE63. That's it. The link is in the show notes. Thanks so much. Now let's get back to the show. So before the ad break, we established pretty clearly that trans people are awesome, and also that they're capable of challenging the status quo just by living their lives and drawing on this sacred pool of knowledge. But why is that status quo even a thing in the first place? Who invented the gender binary, and how is it imposed on people around the world? How are these traditions of sacred genders taken from us? When we're trying to answer that question, why is transphobia a thing, we need to ask questions like, what is gender for? And what does gender do?
Something so basic as like manhood and womanhood can be like wrong or can be questioned. It introduces like instability to like the whole project of like the regime, right? And I think that especially with colonialism, that is like such an important like reason why so many indigenous traditions that were beyond binary gender have been, violently eradicated and suppressed and continue to be so. And why so many countries that were subjected to colonialism have either had their like non-binary traditions like erased or have had to keep that very underground for such a long time.
Surprise, it's white supremacy again. I know, running theme on this show. The gender binary, and especially the gender hierarchy that we currently live under, usually referred to as the patriarchy, is not natural. The idea that men get to own land, property, and money while women should stay home and perform reproductive labor and care labor was imposed onto us. And when this is the system you live under, and if you somehow benefit from that system in one way or another, you become really invested in making sure that system seems natural.
The existence of people that call into question something that is used to prop up empire means that empire is weakened, right? And so when you have these traditions, people who are very invested in projects of colonialism and white supremacy are going to look at it and be like, okay, that's got to go.
From all the historical information that we can gather, white Europeans created the gender hierarchy and implicitly the gender binary and imposed that hierarchy through violence, both on their own women and non-binary people and on the gender diverse people that they went on to colonize. By the way, this portion of the episode comes with an even bigger content warning for a discussion of United States colonialism, specifically against indigenous people, and also a discussion of the German Holocaust. So if that sounds like a bit too much to you, you can either leave now or come back at the time code 1 hour, 10 minutes. Colonialism doesn't just involve taking somebody's land. It requires violence. It requires not just a literal genocide of a people, but a cultural genocide of a people. In North America, for example, this is how many Two-Spirit traditions were forgotten. Not only were indigenous people killed, but their cultural and spiritual practices were systemically removed by things like the residential school systems, which imposed Christianity and a strict white gender binary on indigenous children. This is where gender and race intermingle yet again, because all white people benefit from the idea of the gender binary, including white trans people and white non-binary people.
And that is not to say that white trans people don't uphold white supremacy or colonial values. And I'm not saying that by virtue of being trans, you just get to magically elide all of that messiness. Like, no, we do not get to do that. We are all deeply implicated and responsible for these structures and how they've continued to be showing up in our culture.
Like we said before about having to opt in to sacred knowledge, being transgender doesn't inherently mean that you're radical. Regardless of how you identify internally, you can be trans and perfectly assimilate into one of the two binary genders. Or you can be non-binary and present yourself to the world in a non-traditional way, but still uphold white supremacy in other ways, which itself upholds oppressive structures, including the gender binary. If you're a white trans person, which I myself am, I'm not trying to separate myself from whiteness here, it's only when you challenge white supremacy in all aspects of your life, from your own internal understanding of your gender to your treatment of others, to how you share the sacred knowledge of transness to support your trans siblings of color, that you can maybe start to claim that you're being truly radical.
When you look at sort of these indigenous traditions and how empire has sought to wipe them out, you can see the radical potential for transness that I think white trans people do have the opportunity to tap into if they are willing to really be very robust in their anti-racism and anti-colonialism in a way that does not center their own experience.
As a Black Jewish trans person, YM is all too familiar with colonization and systems of oppression. When I asked them why it is that cis people are so afraid of us, they gave a few answers. The first was that cis people are afraid of how free we are.
Cisness is running in fear from transness. That's why they have to wipe transgender people out of existence.
Similarly to whiteness, cisgenderness, cisness comes with this attitude of moving through the world in a presentable fashion, an attitude of compromising your inner truth in favor of upholding an existing power structure. Trans people know the truth that the gender binary is baloney, and we live that truth, our truth, every day. But cis people just shove that truth down and keep it moving.
We are willing to deal with all the hatred and ridicule to stand in the reality, the truth, the bone deep truth of who they are. And for a cis person that's all about keeping up appearances and keeping up with the Joneses, that is fucking terrifying.
If you can just change your gender, if gender is just made up, that means all the ways in which society is set up, including the mechanisms that screw people over, are all made up too. Which, in my mind, is kind of liberating. If it's all made up, then that means we can change it. We can reshape the world in a way that's equitable. But if you benefit from that power structure, then this kind of thinking is terrifying.
Of course, they have to call transness made up or fake or whatever, because they see us every day standing, rock solid in our truth, regardless of how much backlash or violence is thrown our way. We're still standing in our truth, and we're not budging. And that is fucking when you're someone whose entire life is built around worrying about what other people think of you. That's fucking terrifying.
It's a common tactic of far-right rhetoric to characterize your political opponents as simultaneously very strong and yet very weak. You may have noticed this contradiction just by listening to modern conservatives talk about trans people, if you've been paying attention. Somehow, our agenda has infiltrated all levels of government and all levels of public education, and we're this powerful force that we need the full extent of the law levied against us to stop us. And, also, we're a bunch of confused, weak know-nothings who either don't really exist or exist in such small numbers that we basically don't matter, and so we shouldn't restructure any aspect of our society to accommodate us. These ideas are at odds with each other, but to the conservative brain, it doesn't matter. To them, political rhetoric isn't an expression of their values, it's just a tool that they use to accomplish their political goal of erasing trans people.
When you are that target of trauma, you have to step back in front of it and be like, why is he so scared of me? Wait a minute, if I was so weak, if I was such, if I was such a weakling and pussy, whatever, why is he's literally calling for my state execution? That's, it's just something, it's like you have to hear the fear that cis people are spouting. You have to really hear it.
Speaking of fascism, if we want to talk about how queer history has been erased, we need to talk about an example of modern fascism that isn't brought up nearly enough in either queer or Jewish education, but is shockingly relevant to today.
This major figure in Jewish and Holocaust and LGBTQ history, and so many cisgender, cishet Jews don't even know who he is.
Magnus Hirschfeld was a Jewish physician and sexologist based out of Berlin in the early 20th century. He ran the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, which roughly translates to the Institute for the Science of Sexuality.
So a lot of the clinical approaches and practices that we have for transgender medicine and gender confirmation surgery today, he helped develop.
Hirschfeld's institute was one of the first times in all of Western history that gay and transgender people were studied by a scientific institution in a sympathetic light rather than a skeptical light. Hirschfeld coined the term transsexualism, and trans people were not only clients of the institute, but members of the staff as well.
What he made clear was that transness and queerness, same-sex attraction, gender variance they're just normal human variations. There's nothing abnormal about them.
It may sound odd to you that trans-affirming medicine was being researched in the 1920s and 30s, but this wasn't incredibly unusual for that time period. In fact, the LGBT scene was thriving in Germany at that time.
That this period in German history was probably one of the not liberatory, because they weren't liberated, but it was one of the it was one of the freest times, social liberties wise, for LGBTQ people in Germany.
The Institute also advocated for sex education, contraception, the treatment of sexually transmitted diseases, and women's emancipation. Hell yeah.
He was he was basically a life savior for like thousands of transgender folks across Europe.
In short, the Institute was a beacon of hope and a center of love and acceptance for transgender people in Europe, which is why it was one of the first targets of the Nazi book burnings. In fact, if you learned about the German Holocaust in school, you've probably seen historical photos of the Nazi book burnings. Those weren't just any books. Those were from the Institute.
What's important to note is that when we look at the archive footage of like book burning, right? When they talk about the Nazis did book burning, those books are the books from the Institute, because the first place the brown shirts, one of the first places the brown shirts attacked in Germany was, LGBTQ institutions, and Hirschfeld's Clinic was one of them. So the books that you see burning are all his research on transgender health. That's what you see burning.
Adolf Hitler himself called Magnus Hirschfeld, quote, the world's most dangerous Jew, simply for creating a trans-friendly environment.
He was the most dangerous Jew because he was a doctor of transgender medicine. And like the fact that Hitler saw transgender medicine as a Jewish creation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that matters, cis people. That matters. And I feel like trans Jews are just, we're constantly saying this to cis people, but they're not getting it. This is why you have to fight anti-Semitism and queerphobia together. Anti-Semitism and queerphobia are entwined together. You have to fight them together.
Knowing all of this, it's impossible to separate transphobia from anti-Semitism. The Nazis didn't hate Jewish people for no reason. They were blaming what they saw as society's degradation on Jewish people.
The reason why Jews were targeted was because they blamed Jews for the degradation of German society. The degradation meaning transgender people, right? The degradation meaning disabled people. The degradation meaning gay and lesbian people. That was the point of the anti-Semitism. What fuels anti-Semitism is the belief that Jews are trying to make everyone equal. And that is what anti-Semites hate. Like, I don't want to be equal to trans people. I don't want to be equal to disabled people. And how dare the Jews make it seem like we're equal? How dare the Jews say that how dare the Jews bring in race mixing and queerness and all this stuff that's a threat to my ideal of the Aryan Ubermensch, right? How dare they do this?
Bigots hate the idea of equality. They hate the idea that the power structure that they benefit from can be challenged by the leftist values of democracy and liberation. So they'll find whatever scapegoat they can to legitimize their ideology through rhetoric, and when the timing is right, they'll legitimize that ideology through violence too. This is the missing piece of the puzzle when it comes to education around systemic oppression. Everything is connected, and there are no single-issue bigots. It's not like there are gender issues over here, race issues over there, anti-Semitism over here. Once you say that one type of person is inherently, naturally more worthy than another type of person, it all goes downhill from there. This is what lots of non-queer Jewish people and queer non-Jewish people still need to learn about their shared history of oppression.
I really want cisgender Jewish people to understand the sacrifices that transgender and queer Jews made. And one of those, the fact that so much mainstream Holocaust history forgets Magnus Hirschfeld the Sexual Science Institute in Berlin. It really hurts as a trans Jewish person. It blows my mind. This man's a major figure in our history. And not non-Jewish queer trans people, you have to understand anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is the fuel for the oppression that you face. It's the fuel for it. They think the Jews, scare quotes, created y'all. They don't think you're a real existing human being. These bigots think that you were created by Jews. Your existence was created by Jews. You see how ridiculous that sounds? Like a human experience that's existed ever since humanity's existed, and you think Jews created it? Like again, but again, and this is why we need to understand anti-Semitism, and we need to understand queerphobia, and we need to understand them as working in concert when it comes to modern fascism.
So, now that we recognize the connection between the gender binary, whiteness, colonialism, and anti Semitism, what the heck can we do about it? Taking on all these oppressive systems sounds like a gargantuan task, but it's not all hopeless, especially because we aren't doing it alone. For one thing, if you descend from a group of people who did live through colonization, you can always look back to your ancestors for hope and inspiration.
You know, when we are pushing back against modern day transphobia, we're drawing from those traditions. We are going back and we are studying our ancestors' knowledge and understanding to root ourselves in it. And that's important when you're dealing with a transphobic world that's rooted in white Christian colonialism. You know, I know for me, I'm pushing back on Christianity and whiteness as much as I am on transphobia.
So many amazing cultures and traditions were taken from us, but we can find peace in the knowledge that cultures keep discovering that gender isn't a binary and keep resisting colonization even to this day.
That's not how family was structured in West Africa. You cannot put that on me because that's never been my lived experience. As much as African Americans throughout the ages have tried to conform to Western family and gender norms, and they have tried, our actual culture always came through. Our culture of extended family, matriarchy, always came through, no matter how patriarchal or cis-normative we tried to be. And we have tried to conform to the white Western norms of gender. So I'm so hard. Like even like preachers to this day are they're trying to hold us to these Western gender norms. And and then they, you know, when we don't conform, they want to blame us. They want to say that we're leading to the breakdown of the black family because we're too feminist, too queer, too trans. And it's like, no, we're being ourselves. You're trying to impose this white Western reality of patriarchy onto us. And we have never been that. And we never will be.
We can also continue to stand with trans kids who are currently facing some of the worst backlash in the country right now. Side note, I actually have a past episode on mentoring trans youth for just that reason.
And it, you know, definitely as we as adults look at the landscape and we see the attacks on trans youth, trans kids in schools, trans existence in general, it's like we know why these cis authorities are scared because now the kids have language to describe their experiences. You know, if there's any aspect of trans joy that I have, it's like seeing young people embrace who they are, defend who they are, fight for who they are, challenge the cis adults about who they are. That really brings me, you know, if anything brings me trans joy, it is that.
Conservatives are pissed off at trans kids, which obviously means that they're going through a lot right now, not trying to minimize that, but it also means that literal children are upsetting the dominant power structure, which is kind of awesome.
Exactly. If you got Congress coming after you, if you got whole political parties coming after you as a trans kid, you're winning. Grown, grown up cis adults from the ruling class attacking you, and you're a kid in high school, you're fucking winning. You're winning. Why are adults attacking children at all? Like, what? The most loser adult attacks a child, period, because that's not a fair fight.
It's hard to see that backlash is a good thing, but backlash is a response to real societal progress.
It is scary. It's scary because you see an adult attacking you, saying horrible things about you, threatening your life. You know, the preacher like a couple of months ago who was like saying that all of course he called us all homosexuals, but all LGBTQ people need to be summarily, you know, we need to be tried in the court of law and summarily executed. Like, motherfucker, you scared? And not to minimize the fact that people were traumatized by that bullshit. I know they were. For me, I just hear a weak man. I hear a weak motherfucker when I hear that. You scared as hell. You want to, you think we're so dangerous We need to be summarily executed. Yo, we're winning. You see me as Charles Manson. I'm fucking winning then. Bro.
Out of all the hundreds of anti-trans bills that have been proposed and in many cases passed in the past couple of years, one stands out to be the most. In March of this year, Republican Governor Spencer Cox of Utah vetoed an anti-trans sports bill in an act of kindness towards trans kids that recognized how the bill might very well result in an increase in transgender suicide rates. In his statement following the decision, he points out that out of the 75,000 students playing high school sports in Utah, only 4 of them were transgender, and only 1 of them was a trans student playing in girls' sports. To quote him directly, 4 kids and only 1 of them playing girls' sports. That's what all of this is all about. 4 kids who aren't dominating or winning trophies or taking scholarships. 4 kids who are just trying to find some friends and feel like they're a part of something. 4 kids trying to get through each day. Rarely has so much fear and anger been directed at so few. I don't understand what they're going through or why they feel the way that they do, but I want them to live. And all the research shows that even a little acceptance and connection can reduce suicidality significantly. Utah's Congress quickly went on to overturn that veto and institute the ban anyway. It was in effect for 5 months before being reversed by a state judge in August. We're so tired of this stance. We're so tired of relying on politicians and not elected judges to make sure that we stay alive. There's a coordinated attack on trans rights in this country, which poses both a direct and existential threat to transgender people. We're at risk of having our histories wiped out again. So we need to be just as coordinated in our response. Cis people, please honor us trans people like the sacred beings that we are. Show up to those town hall meetings, put us in positions of leadership, divest from all forms of oppression, not just transphobia, but white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and the rest. And know that when marginalized people ask you to address these things within yourself, know that we're not attacking you. We want you to become better.
If we have an identity that in some way benefits colonialism, like if we're cis men, right? If we're white, if we're Christian, when our fellow community members who don't have those identities criticize us, we feel attacked. We feel attacked by people who are more marginalized than us, and that's what keeps us from fighting with. And it's not an attack. They're calling out the thing that ties you to your oppressor. They're calling that out. So when I'm calling people out for being cis men or being white, that's not me attacking them. I'm not attacking Black cis men. I'm not attacking white trans people or white Jewish people. I'm telling you, that whiteness, that cisness is what connects you to the oppressor.
And trans people, we're not off the hook either, especially us white trans people.
Being trans is great. And also, if you're a white person in America, certainly in any Western country, I would argue, who has not ever questioned or thought about these things, you are 100% perpetuating violence. If you have questions and thought about these things, you're 99% perpetuating violence. It can't stop with just being oh, I'm aware of racism or I'm aware of colonialism. That is not adequate, and I think that all trans people will benefit if white trans people are willing to be humble and to learn from people who have experienced these things and who hold these more complicated intersectional identities.
If you're a white person not challenging the white norms, can you really be non-binary?
Yeah.
Because you don't just challenge the systems, you have to challenge the whiteness with it.
As Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang remind us, decolonization is not a metaphor.
Because the cisness you're fighting is white. You are fighting white cisness. The cisness is not Black or brown, it's white. So as a white trans person, as a white non-binary person, how are you fighting back against that whiteness when and how are you as a trans non-binary person critiquing your own personal investment in whiteness? Because that's the thing about whiteness. White people are invested in it. Until they break free, they are emotionally, socially invested in whiteness.
White trans people, like myself, need to be willing to sacrifice their proximity to white hegemony for the sake of the movement, something that a lot of us are afraid to do, but will actually benefit all of us in the long run.
To be completely in your trans truth, that whiteness has got to go. Like one thing I notice a lot about white trans people, the more that they come into their transgender identity, the bigger the joy. And the more that they pull away from the whiteness, the bigger the joy. I can see it.
And of course, us trans people need to learn our history. Never stop reading about Ballroom, about Star, about all the figures that have come before us, because these are our ancestors and they have so much to teach us.
And also white trans people who do not have solid relationships with BIPOC people. That's never good. That is the BIPOC community, the trans movement in this country was created by BIPOC people. Straight up. Yeah. All of our remedies of transgender survival come from Black and Indigenous people of color. All of them. It's like how I feel about cisgender Jews who don't know who Magnus Hirschfeld is. Like, white trans people who don't know who Francis Thompson is or Dorothy Hicks is, like all these seminal Black transgender figures. Like, you have to know who you are. And who you are is the people that are more marginalized than you. All trans people are our ancestors. So that means trans people from other cultures are our ancestors too.
The final actionable item I have for you is to not let this episode be the last you hear about how gender and colonialism are related. There are tons of great content creators and educators who are making these connections. We're so blessed to live in a time when trans people of color like YM have platforms to discuss their experiences and their histories. So change your algorithm and go listen to them. It's never been easier. And better yet, pay them. Trans people would be nowhere without them, and it's their stories, their wisdom that will save our souls. YM actually does consulting work, just like Eli, and even has their own media company dedicated to telling the stories of marginalized people around the world.
Anybody that lives in this society, I want to help them tell their stories. And, you know, my whole approach is all I do is give you the mic. I give you the mic, I give you the equipment. You tell the story. You shape the story. You do that. Because the short story is not mine.
Sista Yiddishkeit, a name that fuses their Black and Jewish cultures, is YM's political project and social media handle. Go check them out. They're in need of work, and donating to their Cashapp or signing up for a consultation helps with their incredible activism.
You can find me on TikTok and Instagram, and on both my TikTok and Instagram, I have my link tree. So that's where I have my bookings, for if people want to book like consultation meetings with me, that's another thing I do is consultations. And I can consult with you on anything. It doesn't have to be around a specific organ. It doesn't have to be around business. So mainly I do consultations around anti-oppression or organizing training, but it doesn't have to be that. If you want to schedule a meeting with me because you want to talk about supporting your trans kid, we can do that. If you just want to figure out how to organize in your community, we can do that. If you just want to figure out how, as a cis person, to be a better ally to the trans people in your life, we can do that. It does not have to be some big project.
I think it means something that trans people are always trying to create something and are always trying to help people. When I think about the trans people in my life, nearly all of them are artists, writers, educators, builders, healers, activists, or some combination of all of these. It's like we're being called to something greater than ourselves. It's like something deep within us is constantly compelling us to share our truths, share our knowledge with the world. It's why I made this episode, and it's why I do everything that I do. Trans people are sacred, and I'm trying to honor that. How about you? Hi, thanks so much for listening to this very long episode. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to us on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. It helps with the almighty algorithm if you leave us a review and share this episode with a few people who might like it. Basically, if you learned something in this episode, share it with someone. They could also stand to learn. If you really like what you heard, consider becoming a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/rule63, where you can get access to bonus content. Like I mentioned at the mid-roll, every month Danny and I do a bonus episode and a Q&A live stream where you get to chat with us directly. Also, up on the Patreon right now are the full uncut interviews with both Eli and YM. I had such amazing, eye-opening conversations with the both of them, and a good amount of these conversations didn't make it into the episode. Here's a quick preview.
And I'm like, man, I feel like a trans person definitely wrote this myth because, like, that's the dream, right?
Yep. Just pray really hard, and one day, bam, everything will be right.
Yeah, exactly. Also, it happens overnight. Like, I can't tell you how many people come to me and they're like, I just wish there was an easy button. I'm like, I know. I wish there was too.
We all do, honey.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you saw, but this megachurch preacher, T.D. Jakes, was trying to tell, it was his Father's Day speech, right? But he was trying to tell women that you have to make what he says, you have to create a need for me, or else I can't be I can't be present as a husband and father. AKA, I need you to make yourself weaker so that I have a reason to be in your life, which was the most fucked up, demand for patriarchy that I had ever heard in a long time. I literally need you to pretend like you're not strong and capable on your own so I can swoop in and be Prince Charming. Like, what the fuck is that? Like, and
what a weak man.
Yeah, and exactly. Like, what are you saying? And first of all, Reverend Bishop T.D. Jakes, that's what he calls himself. But Bishop Jakes, what are you saying about black men, bro? What are you saying? Are you saying that black cis men are so weak that they need the rest of us to play dead so that they can function? What are you saying, bro? What are you saying? Did you hear what you said?
On Father's Day, no less.
Yeah, right. We have to play dead so you can be good fathers? Huh? What the hell is that?
If you loved our guests this time around, I know I sure did, feel free to connect with them on TikTok, and don't forget to sign up for Eli's class and set up a consultation with YM. All of their info is in the show notes. And one last thing, I recently started my own newsletter on Substack. I write about whatever I'm musing on, usually related to STEM and social justice, plus I round up the news articles I'm reading, music I'm listening to, videos I've watched, and quick and easy action items for those who care about social justice issues. That comes out every Sunday, and you can get it sent to your email inbox every week by subscribing at thatannamarie.substack.com. Okay, that's all for now. I will see you all next month for another Rule 63 episode where we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite clock app. I interviewed 5 TikTokers about their experience with content suppression and community dialogue on the app. It's my most ambitious episode to date in terms of production, and I'm really excited about it. Alrighty then, bye!